Orrin Fletcher hadn't smiled in a year, not since the storm that took his brother. The sun cooked the land, turning the creek to a mere whisper, and Orrin just kept moving south, letting the dust settle on a part of him he thought had died. He was heading for nowhere in particular, which is exactly where he wanted to be. But the wilderness, it has a way of putting things in your path. He saw it at the bend, a splash of color against the brown rock. He pulled his mare to a halt, his heart giving a single hard knock against his ribs. It was a woman, sprawled out, half in the shallow water, her dress soaked and clinging to her like a second skin. She was completely still. Too still. He dropped the reins and was at her side in 3 long strides. Her skin was burning with fever, her breath a shallow, ragged thing. He looked around. Nothing. No wagon, no horse, not another soul under that big, empty sky. Just him, and this woman, who was fading right in front of his eyes. He lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than a sack of flour, a fragile weight against his chest. He carried her to the shade of a cottonwood, the cool of her wet dress seeping into his shirt. He didn't care. He fumbled for his canteen, trickling water onto her cracked lips. Her eyelids fluttered. Then they opened. And Orrin, a man who thought he'd seen it all, stared into the greenest eyes he'd ever known. They were like 2 chips of river jade, startling and bright against the grime on her face. "Where am I?" she rasped, her voice like dry leaves skittering across stone. "You're safe," Orrin said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "Found you by the creek." He helped her sit up. She winced, a map of pain etched onto her features. "My name's Orrin Fletcher." He offered her the canteen again. She took a small sip, her throat working. "You got a name?" She hesitated just for a second, but it was long enough for Orrin to notice. "Gwen," she said. "Gwen Holly." Orrin watched her, really watched her. There was a story here, a bad one. "What happened, Gwen? How'd you end up out here alone?" Her gaze dropped to her hands. "Wagon group," she said, her voice small and tight. "I was with a group from Deer Lodge. My horse went lame. I fell behind. Thought I could catch up." Orrin felt a knot of suspicion tighten in his gut. A wagon train doesn't just leave someone behind. Not out here, not a woman alone. They just don't. He'd seen plenty of folks on the trail, and none of them would abandon one of their own to the buzzards. "You walked for 2 days?" he asked, keeping his voice level. She nodded, not meeting his eyes. "Headed to a ranch near Stevensville. They're expecting me. For a cooking job." It all sounded a little too neat, a little too rehearsed. He saw the sharp lines of hunger and fear on her face, but there was something else too, something she was holding back. "You got family?" he asked. Her breath hitched. "No, not anymore." That part, he believed. The pain in her voice was real. He didn't push. He knew a closed door when he saw one. "You need rest," he said, getting to his feet. "I've got a bedroll. Enough food for 2. I'm not leaving you here." She looked up at him then, her green eyes wide with a question. "Why? Why are you helping me?" Orrin paused. He'd been riding away from everything, from memories, from people. But looking down at her, so lost and alone, he felt a flicker of something he thought was long dead. "Because you need it," he said simply. "And because you gave me a reason to stop." That night they made camp under a blanket of stars so thick you could almost touch them. Orrin kept the fire going while Gwen slept, wrapped in his only spare blanket. He watched her, the firelight dancing on her face. Her story didn't add up. It was full of holes a mule could walk through. But the exhaustion, the fever, that was real. The fear in her eyes when she first woke up, that was real too. She was running from something, not just trying to catch up to a wagon train. He knew it in his bones, the same way he knew when a storm was brewing in the mountains. He woke her when the coffee was ready, strong and black. He handed her a strip of jerky, and she ate like she hadn't seen food in a week. "You always travel alone?" she asked, her voice softer now. "Mostly," he nodded. "Since my brother died last spring." Her eyes softened with a flicker of sympathy. "I'm sorry." He just shrugged, staring into the flames. Storm took him. One minute he was there, the next, gone. The lie came easy. Too easy. The truth was messier. The truth was something he never spoke of. The silence that fell between them wasn't empty. It was filled with all the things they weren't saying. The next morning, he helped her onto his mare, and she settled behind him, her arms circling his waist. Her touch was a jolt, a warmth that spread through his worn-out coat and settled deep in his chest. It was a feeling he hadn't felt in so long. He'd forgotten it existed. They rode slow, following the trail that snaked toward the Bitterroot Valley. She was light against his back, her head resting between his shoulder blades. It felt right. By midday, the sky turned a bruised purple, and the heavens opened up. Thunder cracked like a whip across the mountains. Orrin found a small rock overhang, and they huddled together under a canvas tarp, the rain drumming a frantic rhythm just inches away. A gust of wind nearly ripped the tarp from his hands, and she laughed. It was a soft, startled sound, like a bird taking flight. The first real, unguarded sound he'd heard from her. It made him want to hear it again. "You don't even know me," she said, her smile a faint ghost on her lips. "I'm getting to," he said, and the simple truth of it hung in the air between them. By the third day, they reached a fork in the trail. Color had returned to her cheeks. The fever was gone. She looked stronger, more alive. "Stevensville is that way," he said, pointing with his chin. "The ranch you were talking about should be a day's ride." Her hands tightened at his waist. "What about you?" she asked, her voice quiet. "Which way are you going?" He looked down the other path, the one that led south. The one that led to more emptiness, more riding, more forgetting. "Hadn't decided?" he said. The silence stretched. He could feel her breath on his back. He could feel the question she was afraid to ask. So he waited. "Would you—" she started, then stopped. "Would you come with me? To the ranch?" He turned in the saddle to look at her. Her green eyes were wide, honest, and for the first time unafraid. He saw his own loneliness reflected there. And in that moment, the path south didn't seem to matter anymore. He nodded, a single decisive motion. "If you want me to." "I do," she whispered. As they took the trail to Stevensville, Orrin Fletcher felt the corner of his mouth twitch upwards. It wasn't a smile. Not yet. But it was close. He was riding towards something instead of away, and for a man who'd been lost for a year, that was everything. But as the valley opened up before them, a beautiful vista of green pastures and distant homesteads, a cold dread began to creep up his spine. Her story was a lie. He knew it, and they were riding straight into whatever she was running from. The ranch was nestled in a crook of the hills, a tidy spread with a whitewashed house and a barn that had seen better days. Smoke curled from the chimney, a peaceful, welcoming sight. But as they got closer, Gwen grew tense behind him, her grip on his waist becoming iron tight. A woman came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on an apron. She was sturdy, her face weathered by sun and worry. Her eyes narrowed as they rode into the yard. "Afternoon," the woman called out, her voice flat without welcome. "You must be the one Harlan sent for." Orrin felt Gwen flinch. It was a small movement, but he felt it all the way through him. It was a jolt of pure, undiluted terror. He swung down from the mare, his hand instinctively going to the worn handle of the pistol at his hip. He looked at Gwen. The color had drained from her face. She looked like she'd seen a ghost, and in that instant, Orrin knew. They hadn't found a sanctuary. They had walked straight into the heart of the trap. The woman on the porch, her eyes like chips of flint, wasn't a stranger. And Harland wasn't an employer. He was the thing in the dark she'd been running from all along. The woman's name was Maven, and the way she looked at Gwen wasn't with the curiosity you give a new hired hand. It was a look of cold recognition, a look that said, "So you finally showed your face." "I'm Maven," she said, her eyes flicking from Gwen's pale face to Orrin, taking in his dusty clothes, his guarded stance. "My husband's out with the herd. You're early." The words were simple, but the meaning was clear. You weren't expected. Not really. Gwen slid down from the horse, her movements stiff. Harlan said you needed a cook," she stammered. Maven gave a short, hard nod. "That we do. There's a room in the back for you." Then she turned her gaze on Orrin, and it was like being measured for a coffin. "And you? Just passing through?" Orrin glanced at Gwen. She wouldn't meet his eyes. Her whole body was screaming run, but there was nowhere to go. "Thought I might stay a bit," Orrin said, his voice low and even. "Lend a hand if you need one." He wasn't asking. He was telling her. He wasn't leaving Gwen alone here. Not now. Not ever. Maven's lips thinned into a bloodless line. "There's room in the barn," she said, then turned and went back inside, letting the screen door slam shut behind her. The sound echoed in the sudden heavy silence of the yard. Later that day, while Gwen was inside, trapped in the kitchen with the woman who was clearly her warden, Orrin walked the property. It was a good ranch, well tended, but it felt wrong. The fences seemed less like they were for keeping cattle in, and more like they were for keeping people from getting out. He saw two ranch hands mending a fence in the distance. They stopped and watched him, their hands resting on their tools. They weren't curious. They were guards. That evening, Gwen found him in the barn, where he was pretending to oil his saddle. Her face was pale, her eyes haunted. "We have to leave," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We can't. Not tonight. They're watching us." "Orrin, you don't understand." "Then make me understand," he said, his voice hard but his eyes soft. He took her hands. They were ice cold. And that's when the story came pouring out of her. Not the neat, tidy lie about the wagon train, the real story, the ugly one. Harland wasn't a man who had offered her a job. He was a wealthy, powerful man from Deer Lodge, a man who thought he owned everything he saw. And he had seen Gwen. He'd wanted her. And what Harland wanted, he took. She hadn't been his wife, not legally. She'd been his property, trapped by threats and his cold, casual cruelty. She had finally found the courage to run, taking nothing but the clothes on her back. She'd heard about this ranch, a place far away where she could disappear. She never imagined it was connected to him. She never imagined the trap she was running toward. "Maven," Gwen whispered, her voice breaking. "She's not his friend. She's his sister." The world tilted under Orrin's feet. They were in the lion's den, and the lion was on his way. "She's sent for him, hasn't she?" Orrin asked. Gwen nodded, tears finally tracking clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. "He'll be here in a few days. He'll take me back. Orrin, what he'll do to me." She couldn't finish. She didn't have to. Orrin pulled her close, his arms a protective circle around her. He could feel her shaking, the desperate, terrified tremors running through her body. He was no longer just a drifter. He was this woman's only hope. And as he held her in the dusty dark of the barn, he made a silent vow. Harland could come, but he wasn't taking her. He would have to go through Orrin Fletcher first. And Orrin was a man who had nothing left to lose. Or so he thought. The next few days were a special kind of hell, a quiet, waiting hell. Maven treated them with a cold, formal civility that was more menacing than open hostility. She put them to work, Orrin mending the very fences that held them captive, Gwen in the kitchen under her watchful eye. They were prisoners, plain and simple. Every time a rider appeared on the horizon, Gwen would flinch, her breath catching in her throat. Orrin felt a constant, low-level hum of adrenaline, his senses on high alert. He was watching the ranch hands, watching Maven, watching the road. He was a wolf in a cage, waiting for the real monster to show up. He and Gwen stole moments in the barn late at night, whispering in the dark. He learned more about Harland, about his charm that could turn to ice in a second, about his possessive rage. The picture she painted was of a man who was a pillar of the community on the outside and a cold-blooded tyrant behind closed doors. And the more she talked, the more a chilling memory began to stir in the back of Orrin's mind. "My brother," Orrin said one night, the words tasting like ash. "He got mixed up with a man from Deer Lodge, a business deal that went bad, a man who had the whole town in his pocket." Gwen went still. What was his name? Orrin had tried to bury the name for a year. He'd tried to drink it away, ride it away, but it was always there, branded on his memory. "Harland," he said. "His name was Harland Cole." Gwen let out a choked sob. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a nightmare they were both trapped in. The storm that killed his brother wasn't a storm of lightning and rain. It was a storm of greed and violence. His brother had been cheated, then silenced. Orrin had found him. It was a scene he relived every single night. And Orrin had run. Not from grief, but from a helplessness so profound it had nearly suffocated him. He couldn't prove anything. Harland owned the law, the town, everything. All Orrin could do was ride away before he ended up in the ground next to his brother. And now, fate, in its cruelest twist, had led him right back to the man who had destroyed his life. He wasn't just fighting for Gwen anymore. He was fighting for his brother. He was fighting for himself. The next morning, one of the ranch hands rode out early, heading east, toward Deer Lodge. Orrin knew what it was. A message. "She's here. Come and get her." The clock was ticking. They couldn't outrun Harland's reach. The snows had started in the high country, cutting off the mountain passes. The only way out was the main road, the very road Harland would be riding in on. They were cornered. That evening, a circuit rider, a traveling preacher making his rounds, stopped at the ranch for the night. He was a thin, reedy man with kind eyes, carrying a satchel of letters and news from the towns along his route. Maven offered him a bed, a rare crack in her icy demeanor. During supper, the preacher handed out the mail he'd brought. There was a letter for Maven, which she tucked into her apron pocket without reading. And then he handed an envelope to Orrin. Orrin froze. No one knew he was here. No one ever wrote to him. His hands trembled slightly as he took it. It wasn't a letter. It was a folded piece of paper, a flyer from the Cattlemen's Association in Helena. But when he opened it, it wasn't about cattle prices. It was a notice, an official document. The last of his brother's land and herd were being sold off, to settle outstanding debts. And the name of the man who had bought it all, for pennies on the dollar, was printed in bold black ink at the bottom of the page. Harland Cole. He hadn't just taken his brother's life. He had erased him. Orrin looked up from the paper, his eyes meeting Maven's across the table. And in her cold, triumphant gaze, he saw his own death sentence. Because now she knew exactly who he was. He wasn't just some drifter who had stumbled upon her runaway prize. He was a Fletcher, and Harland Cole didn't leave Fletchers alive. The air in the room went thick and heavy. The preacher kept talking about his travels, oblivious to the silent war being waged over the dinner table. Orrin folded the notice, his knuckles white. He looked at Gwen. Her face was a mask of terror. She knew what this meant. There was no more pretending. There was no more hiding. Maven stood up, a thin, cruel smile playing on her lips. "I think it's time you moved out of the barn, Mr. Fletcher," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "We have a spare room. It locks from the outside. I insist." It wasn't an offer. It was a verdict. They were being moved from the cage into the holding cell, waiting for the executioner to arrive. The ranch hands, who had been eating silently at the other end of the table, stood up. They weren't farm hands anymore. They were jailers. Orrin knew he could probably take them, but not them and Maven. Not without getting Gwen hurt. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. For now, he would play their game. He let them lead him and Gwen to a small, windowless room at the back of the house. The door slammed shut behind them, and they heard the heavy scrape of a bolt sliding into place. They were trapped. "What do we do?" Gwen whispered, her voice frantic in the darkness. Orrin pulled her to him, his mind racing. They weren't going to wait for Harland. They weren't going to be lambs led to the slaughter. Harland had made one mistake. He thought Orrin was like his brother, a rancher who knew cattle, but not violence. He was wrong. The storm had taken his brother, but it had forged Orrin into something else entirely. Something hard. Something unforgiving. "Tonight," Orrin whispered back, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "We get out of here tonight, or we die trying." He ran his hands along the walls in the pitch-black room. Wood planks. Solid. He pressed his ear to the door. He could hear the low murmur of voices from the kitchen. Maven and her men. They were waiting, relaxing. They thought they had won. He moved to the back wall, the exterior wall. He knocked on it softly. Some sections felt more solid than others. He remembered the layout of the house from the outside. This room was part of a newer addition. The construction might be shoddy. He pressed his shoulder against the planks, testing them. One board gave just a fraction of an inch. Hope, sharp and fierce, surged through him. He took off his boot and, using the heel, began to work at the edges of the board. It was slow, agonizing work. Every creak of the wood sounded like a gunshot in the silent house. Gwen stood watch at the door, her body pressed against it, listening. "They're still talking," she breathed. "One of them is walking around, pacing." Orrin worked faster, sweat stinging his eyes. The wood groaned in protest. He pried with his fingers, the splinters digging into his skin. Finally, with a low crack, a section of the board splintered away, revealing a sliver of the moonlit night outside. It was just big enough to see through. The barn was 50 yards away. His horse was in there. His gun was in his saddlebag. Everything they needed. But between them and the barn stood one of the ranch hands, leaning against a fence post, a rifle cradled in his arms. A sentinel. "There's a guard," Orrin whispered. Gwen's hope faltered. "We're not going to make it." "Yes, we are," Orrin said, his voice grim. He thought about the ranch, about the tools in the shed, the layout of the yard. He had spent the last few days mending fences, but he had also been memorizing every shadow, every escape route. He wasn't just a ranch hand. He was a survivor. "The preacher," Orrin said suddenly. "Where is he sleeping?" "The front room by the porch," Gwen whispered back. An idea, desperate and dangerous, began to form in Orrin's mind. It was a long shot. It was probably going to get them killed, but it was better than waiting for Harland. He began working on the board again, not trying to remove it, but to loosen it enough. He needed a weapon, he needed a distraction, and he needed a little bit of luck from a god he'd stopped believing in a year ago. The board came loose. He worked it back and forth until he could pull it free. It was a heavy, solid piece of oak, 2 feet long. A makeshift club. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. "When I go," he told Gwen, his voice barely audible, "I need you to scream. As loud as you can. Make them think I'm hurting you. Make them come for the door." She looked at him, her eyes wide with fear, but she nodded. She understood. He was going to turn their prison into a weapon, He was going to bring the fight to them. He took a deep breath, the cold night air filling his lungs. He looked at Gwen, a silent promise passing between them. Then he smashed the butt of his boot against the door, a single explosive bang. And as Gwen let out a blood-curdling scream, Orrin burst through the weakened back wall like a man possessed. The guard by the fence spun around, startled by the scream and the crash of splintering wood. That was all the time Orrin needed. He was a blur in the moonlight, a silent shadow moving with deadly speed. He brought the heavy plank down on the back of the guard's head. The man crumpled without a sound. Orrin didn't hesitate. He grabbed the rifle and sprinted for the barn. Inside the house, he could hear shouting. The heavy bolt on their door was being thrown back. The trap had been sprung. He reached the barn, his heart hammering against his ribs. He saddled his mare with frantic, practiced movements. He grabbed his own pistol from his saddlebag, checking the load. The familiar weight in his hand was comforting. He was no longer defenseless. He led the horse to the big barn doors, just as two figures burst from the back of the house, the second ranch hand and Maven. The man raised his pistol. A shot rang out, the bullet splintering the doorframe next to Orrin's head. Orrin fired back, not aiming to kill but to drive them back. He saw the man dive for cover. He swung himself up onto his mare and spurred her out into the yard. He rode straight for the back of the house, where Gwen was supposed to be waiting. But she wasn't there. For a terrifying second, he thought they'd gotten to her. Then he saw her. She hadn't run. She was standing by the woodshed, a heavy splitting axe in her hands, her face pale but resolute, standing over the unconscious form of the circuit preacher. She hadn't screamed and waited. She had created her own distraction. "They went for the door and I went for the preacher's room," she yelled as he galloped toward her. "I told him they were trying to kill you. He ran out the front to get help." It was brilliant. She hadn't just followed his plan, she had improved it. She'd sent the only outsider for a help that would never come in time, but his panicked flight would draw the attention of Maven's man. Orrin reached down and pulled her up behind him, the axe still clutched in her hand. "Hold on!" he yelled. They thundered across the yard and onto the main road, heading away from the ranch, away from the prison that had almost been their tomb. They rode hard into the night, the wind tearing at them, the sound of hoofbeats a desperate prayer. They didn't look back. They didn't dare. But they both knew this wasn't over. They hadn't escaped. They had just declared war. And Harlan Cole was not a man who accepted defeat. He would hunt them. And he would not stop until they were both in the ground. The chase was on. They rode until the mare was slick with sweat and foam, her breath coming in ragged bursts. Orrin knew he was pushing her too hard, but he had no choice. They had to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the ranch before sunrise, before Harlan got the news, before the real hunt began. They finally stopped in a thick grove of aspen, the pale trunks like ghostly bars in the moonlight. The horse stood trembling, head down. Gwen slid to the ground, her legs shaking so badly she could barely stand. Orrin dismounted, his eyes scanning the darkness, listening. The world was silent, save for the whisper of the wind through the leaves. "He'll send men," Gwen said, her voice hollow. "He has trackers. They'll find us." "Let them," Orrin said, his voice a low growl. He was checking the rifle he'd taken from the guard. It was fully loaded. His own pistol was secure at his hip. "I'm done running from him, Gwen. This ends. One way or another." He looked at her, at the raw courage that had replaced the fear in her eyes. She had stood her ground with an axe in her hands. She was no damsel in distress. She was a survivor, just like him. A new, fierce protectiveness washed over him, so powerful it almost buckled his knees. This was no longer just about his brother's memory. It was about her. It was about the future he suddenly, desperately wanted with her. They pushed on at dawn, abandoning the main road for the rugged, broken country of the foothills. It was slower, harder going, but it was their only chance. Orrin knew this land. He and his brother had run cattle through these hills for years. He knew the hidden trails, the box canyons, the places where a man could disappear or make a stand. For 2 days, they moved like ghosts, eating jerky from Orrin's saddlebag, drinking from icy mountain streams. They saw no one, but they felt it, the sensation of being watched, hunted. On the 3rd morning, Orrin saw them. 3 riders, far below them on the valley floor, moving slowly, methodically. Trackers, Harlan's men. They were good, but Orrin was better. "They're closing in," he said, his voice grim. "We can't outrun them in the open." He pointed to a narrow, rock-strewn canyon ahead of them. "In there! It's called Jacob's Ladder. Treacherous. One way in, one way out. They'll follow us. They'll have to come in single file." Gwen looked at the dark maw of the canyon. "It's a trap." "Yeah," Orrin said, a hard glint in his eye. "For them." He positioned Gwen in a small alcove high up on the canyon wall, hidden from view below. He gave her the rifle. "You know how to use this?" She nodded, her hand steady as she took the weapon. "My father taught me. Point and shoot." "Good," Orrin said. "Don't shoot unless you have to, but if they get past me, you don't hesitate." He looked at her, his heart in his throat. He leaned in and kissed her, a hard, desperate kiss full of fear and promise. "I'll be back," he whispered. Then he was gone, scrambling down the rocks like a mountain goat, disappearing into the shadows below. He found his spot 100 yards from the canyon entrance, a narrow ledge behind a massive boulder. He had a clear line of sight. He settled in, his pistol in his hand, and he waited. The silence was absolute. An hour passed, then another. Then he heard it, the clink of a horseshoe on rock. They were coming. The first rider entered the canyon, a big man with a cruel face, his rifle held ready. He moved cautiously, his eyes scanning the canyon walls. He passed Orrin's hiding place. Orrin let him go. The second rider followed, and then the third. They were all in the trap. Orrin stepped out from behind the boulder. "Looking for someone?" he called out, his voice echoing off the rock walls. The men spun around, surprise and then fury on their faces. The first man raised his rifle, but Orrin was faster. His pistol bucked in his hand, the shot deafening in the enclosed space. The man grunted, clutching his shoulder, his rifle clattering to the ground. The other 2 dove for cover, firing wildly. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks around Orrin, sending stone chips flying. He dropped back behind the boulder, the smell of gunpowder sharp in the air. This was it. The fight he'd been running from for a year. But he wasn't running anymore. He was home. A shot from above. The second man, who had been trying to flank him, cried out and fell, the rifle Gwen was holding smoking in her hands. She had made her choice. She was fighting with him. Down to 1. The last man was pinned down, terrified. "Give it up!" Orrin yelled. "Harlan's not worth dying for." "He pays well," the man yelled back, and fired another shot that went wide. Orrin saw his chance. While the man reloaded, Orrin vaulted over the boulder and charged, closing the distance in seconds. The fight was brutal and short. Orrin was fueled by a year of grief and rage. He disarmed the man and knocked him unconscious with the butt of his pistol. It was over. The trap had worked. But this was just the beginning. These were just the dogs. The master was still out there. They tied the 3 men securely, leaving them with water but taking their horses and weapons. They rode out of the canyon and headed higher into the mountains, toward the one place Orrin knew they would be safe. His brother's old line shack, a remote, half-forgotten cabin nestled in a hidden meadow. No one knew it was there. No one but him. They arrived at dusk, the cabin a dark silhouette against the fiery sunset. It was small, dusty, but it was a fortress. That night, by the light of a small fire, the wall between them finally crumbled. "My brother, Harlan had him ambushed," Orrin confessed, the words tearing out of him. It wasn't a storm. It was murder. I found him, and I ran. I was a coward. No, Gwen said, taking his hand. You were a survivor. You're still a survivor. We both are. They held each other in the quiet dark, two broken people finding solace in each other's arms. The world outside, with its monsters and its hunters, faded away. In that small cabin, under a roof he had built with his brother, Orrin Fletcher finally felt a flicker of peace. But he knew it was fleeting. Harland wouldn't send more men. He was a man who liked to finish things himself. He was coming. And Orrin would be ready. He wasn't just defending a cabin. He was defending his life, his future. He was defending the woman who had taught him how to smile again. This was his last stand. The first snow of winter began to fall, thick, wet flakes that quickly blanketed the high country in a shroud of white. The world went silent. It was beautiful, but it was also a closing door. The snow would trap them in the mountains, but it would also cover their tracks. For a week, they lived in a strange, suspended peace. Orrin hunted, his brother's old rifle sure in his hands. Gwen made the tiny cabin a home, her quiet strength a constant source of wonder to him. They talked for hours, filling in the empty spaces of their pasts, their fears, their dreams. They were falling in love, not in the easy way of peacetime, but in the desperate, fierce way of soldiers in a foxhole. They were all each other had. But every morning, Orrin would climb to the ridge above the cabin and scan the valley below. He knew Harland wouldn't give up. A man like that saw Gwen not as a person, but as a possession that had been stolen, an insult to his power, and he would come to reclaim what he believed was his. One morning, Orrin saw him, a lone rider, a black speck moving against the vast, white expanse of the valley. He was moving slowly, patiently, not like a man who was lost, but like a predator tracking its prey. Harland. He's here, Orrin said when he returned to the cabin, his voice flat. Gwen looked up from the fire, her face pale but her eyes steady. Alone? For now, Orrin said. He's arrogant. He thinks he can handle me himself. He began to prepare. He checked his weapons. He barricaded the single window. He planned his lines of fire. This cabin wasn't just a shelter, it was a fortress of his own design. He knew every rock, every tree, every shadow. This was his ground. Harland arrived at midday. He didn't ride up to the cabin. He dismounted a quarter-mile away and approached on foot, moving with a confident, unhurried stride. He was dressed in a fine black wool coat, a stark figure against the snow. He looked like an undertaker coming to claim a body. He stopped 50 yards from the cabin. "Orrin Fletcher!" he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "I know you're in there, and I know you have something that belongs to me. Send her out, and I might let you live." Orrin opened the cabin door and stepped out, his rifle in his hand. He stood on the small porch, the cold air biting at his face. "She doesn't belong to anyone, Harland. Especially not you." Harland smiled, a cold, empty thing. "Your brother said something similar, right before he begged for his life." Orrin's blood ran cold. The rage he had kept banked for a year roared to life. "This is between you and me, Harland. Let her go. Let her ride out, and you and I can settle this." "I think not," Harland said, and in a blur of motion, he drew a pistol from inside his coat. But Orrin was ready. He had known this was coming. He dove back into the cabin as the first shot splintered the doorframe where his head had been. The battle had begun. Shots were exchanged, a deadly back and forth. Harland was a good shot, but he was in the open. Orrin was behind solid log walls. The advantage was his, but Harland was cunning. He stopped shooting, and a tense silence fell. Orrin waited, his senses screaming. He knew Harland was moving, circling the cabin, looking for a weakness. Then he heard it. A scraping sound from the back. The chimney. Harland was climbing onto the roof, a desperate gamble. Orrin looked up at the stone fireplace. An idea, born of desperation and a deep knowledge of this cabin, sparked in his mind. He grabbed a small tin of lamp oil from the mantel. Gwen looked at him, her eyes wide with question. "Stay back," he ordered. He uncorked the tin and threw the contents up into the fireplace, splashing the oil onto the hot stones and the soot-caked flue. Then, he grabbed a burning log from the fire with a pair of tongs and shoved it deep into the chimney's opening. A roar erupted from the fireplace as the oil and a year's worth of creosote ignited. A massive plume of fire and black, choking smoke shot out of the top of the chimney like a volcano. A strangled scream came from the roof, followed by the sound of a body thudding into the snow. Orrin burst out the front door, his pistol ready. Harland was on the ground, his fine coat smoldering, his face blackened with soot, gasping for air. His pistol lay in the snow a few feet away. Orrin kicked it away. It was over. Harland looked up at him, his eyes filled with disbelief and hatred. "You should have killed me," he rasped. Orrin stood over him, the pistol aimed at his heart. Every fiber of his being screamed for revenge, for his brother, for Gwen, for the year he had lost to grief and fear. He could end it, right here. No one would ever know. But then he looked back at the cabin door. Gwen was standing there watching him, and in her eyes he didn't see a killer. He saw the man who had saved her, the man she loved. He lowered the pistol. "No," Orrin said, his voice ragged. "You're going to face the law. You're going to stand trial for what you did to my brother. You're not getting the easy way out." He had won. Not by becoming a monster like Harland, but by choosing to be something better. Justice was coming, not from the end of his gun, but from the truth, finally dragged into the light. They brought Harland down from the mountain and delivered him to the sheriff in the next town over. With the testimony of the men they'd captured and Orrin's own story, the case against Harland Cole was ironclad. His reign of terror was over. The cloud that had hung over Orrin's life for so long finally lifted. Standing on the steps of the sheriff's office with Gwen's hand in his, he felt the sun on his face and, for the first time in over a year, he smiled. A true, real smile. They didn't go back to the ranch. They couldn't. But Maven, in a surprising act of penance, signed over the deed to the small house behind the orchard, a place for them to start over. They returned to the valley not as fugitives, but as homesteaders. They repaired the little house, planted a garden, and built a life, piece by piece. The silence between them was no longer filled with unspoken fears, but with a deep, abiding peace. One spring morning, as they planted rows of corn under a bright blue sky, Gwen took his hand and placed it on her belly. Orrin felt a tiny flutter, a flicker of new life. He dropped to his knees in the rich, dark earth and pressed his face to her, tears of a joy he never thought he'd feel again streaming down his face. They named their son Caleb, and he grew up strong and steady, with his mother's green eyes and his father's quiet strength. He learned to walk under the shade of the same cottonwood tree where Orrin had first found a broken woman by a creek. Years passed, the seasons turned. Orrin and Gwen grew old together, their love a steady flame against the harshness of the world. They had faced the darkest parts of the wilderness and the darkest parts of men, and they had not only survived, they had built a paradise, a quiet, simple life, earned with blood and courage, a life of peace. If you enjoyed this story of how true justice can be found in the most unexpected places, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe for more tales from the forgotten corners of history.